Hello, and welcome to Coffee with the Dean, a series for Lent in the year 2022. I'm Leanna Fuller, Interim Academic Dean here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and I am here today with Dr. Tanner Capps, who serves as the very new director of the Miller Summer Youth Institute. Tanner, it's great to be in conversation with you today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
As is our custom, our discussion today is going to focus on the lectionary readings for this week, which include Isaiah 55, 1 through 9, Psalm 63, 1 through 8, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13, and Luke chapter 13, 1 through 9. We're going to be touching on all of these today, but we're also going to focus a little bit later in our conversation on the Isaiah passage. So Tanner, I'm just going to jump right in with our questions for today. First, many pastors and other leaders are preparing to preach or teach on these passages this week. What is one theme or learning that you would recommend that they give some attention to?
Yeah, thank you, Leanna. As I was working through the Isaiah 55 passage, I think the thing that showed up most to me was the deep integration of bodily eating and feeding of the soul. And I think that that runs throughout all of these passages. You know, we get a parable that teaches a spiritual lesson based on the production of the fig tree or its lack of production. And then we have in the Isaiah passage these series of commands about coming to eat and coming to drink, and then there's spiritual admonition that accompanies it. So I was really struck. I don't know how this would preach, but I think there's a lot of possibility here of reflecting deeply on how our bodily practices affect our spiritual practices and vice versa. We can talk about this more in a minute, but I was also struck by the kind of irony of the divine economy in the Isaiah passage. It says, come and buy, come and purchase, but it's essentially free. And so I was also struck by the sort of reversal of economies of scarcity and economies of abundance. And I know we can talk about that more in a minute, but those are two things, if I were preaching this, that I would really spend some time reflecting on and applying to our current situation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Let's dig in a little bit to that first point that you made about sort of the bodily practices. So 3 of the 4 lectionary passages this week do include vivid language about eating and drinking. And the 4th, as you mentioned, the gospel reading, talks about a fig tree that bears no fruit. So could you kind of go a little bit deeper with this point and talk some about the importance of eating and drinking language in Scripture, particularly in this season of Lent? It's interesting because, of course, in Lent, we're usually thinking about practices of restraint in some way, right? Some people give up certain kinds of food or drink during Lent. So this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition, I would think.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting choice too for the set of readings. And that, you know, I mean, when you sit down and really reflect on it, eating and drinking's everywhere in Scripture. It's in Genesis at the very beginning. You know, there's abundance and there's commands about eating and what not to eat, you know, and it's fairly minimal, and yet they eat and they transgress first humans. But I was thinking about the diversity, and we could go on and on and on, of course, but also, you know, right up front in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus departs, and the sort of ascetic Jesus, you know, he goes out to be tested, and he seems very much bound to these practices of restraint as he goes out to be tested in the wilderness prior to coming back to offer up the ministry. And so, yeah, I don't know what to say about it. I think that we see a lot of abundance, you know, around eating and drinking in Scripture. And then we also see passages that commend practices of denial and, you know, dare I say, even self-abnegation. So I don't know quite what to do with that. I know that, you know, one thing that I thought about too that's more church historical than biblical, but, you know, historically the Reformed have had some ambivalence towards Lent, I mean,
Sure.
Zwingli, famously eats like the blood sausage,
Yeah.
in defiance of, Lenten practices in the 16th century. So, and I get that, I mean, sort of dour reflection and denial is, people have a hard time with that, and that's okay. But I think that there's a lot to be commended there as well. And so I think that kind of goes back to discerning economies of abundance by withdrawal, if we've been too deeply immersed in economies of excess. So yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the balance is important.
Sure. Yeah.
In a certain way. Actually, what you were just saying reminds me of the movie Chocolat. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I haven't.
But it's a town, a village in France that is just extremely kind of very religious and very rigid kind of in their practices around, especially around Lent, and just total, self-denial, self-abnegation, like we were saying. And a woman, a stranger, comes into town and opens up a chocolate shop right in the middle of Lent. And it kind of, it opens
That's
up
awesome.
all these really interesting events and relationships. And it's a great movie to explore sort of this theme of balance and when might we actually seek out practices of indulgence, even maybe
Right.
certain times in our lives or in certain seasons versus other ways of disciplining ourselves. It's a really interesting movie, but it made me think of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Babette's Feast and that.
Yeah.
Sort of thing too. Yeah.
Yeah. Similar themes for sure. Yeah.
But I think you're right that right up front in the Isaiah passage, it's commending abundance and come and eat, come and drink. And through this, we press ever deeper into spiritual discernment. So.
Yeah, so let's dig a little bit more into the Isaiah 55 passage here in the time we've got left. We were just talking about this interesting sort of almost dichotomy between abundance and denial. And as we were talking about earlier, Lent tends to be associated more with the latter, more with fasting and denial. But as you were just saying, the Isaiah passage has this invitation to abundant life. Delight yourselves in rich food is one of the phrases from there. And it's inviting the people of Israel to receive abundant pardon from God and to be glorified as a nation. So thinking about this passage, what message of hope and abundance would you say we're in need of today? And how can the prophet's words here help us to maintain that hope?
Yeah, goodness. I mean, I really, was wrestling with that reading this. I think that, no one would deny that right now, especially in the recent events that have unfolded, there's a lot of fear. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what could happen. And I wonder, to kind of go back to the economies of God thought that a lot of the fear is driven by economies of scarcity, or at least perceived scarcity. And, if I were preaching this, reflecting on, delight in the rich food and these imperatives that Isaiah 55 is shot through with, I would really want to challenge my congregation, in its specific context to ask the sort of metaphorical question: what is our spiritual food? What are the things that God has provided in the midst of a pandemic, pending warfare that could get out of control quickly? What does it mean to delight in God and in an abundant economy? And I don't know, these gifts are diverse. And I think they're very context specific. So I would spend time kind of making that move, the contextual move from the scripture itself to the resources that our congregations and our communities actually have in their midst. And I think that if we were to begin to reflect critically on that, we might see some treasures that are hidden in plain sight. And I know that I need to do that. And I don't think it takes denial to begin to see that. And I think that's the beauty, the kind of ironic beauty of the the Isaiah 55 passage, and to some degree, I find the parable and the Luke passage incredibly weird. But I think there's something there, as well about this, like waiting on the fig tree to produce and begging, the gardener begs the owner of the land, just give it one more year and maybe we'll see some fruit. And so I think that discernment is really at the heart of what we ought to be doing with these passages as we move into the season of Lent.
Yeah, I think that's a really intriguing question you asked a little while ago. What's the spiritual food that sustains us during these very uncertain times? I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. So thanks for that question, Tanner. I think we've come to the end of our questions and our time today. But thank you very much for being here with us. It was great talking with you.
Great talking with you too. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
All right.